The screams that tore through Berkeley Castle on September 21st, 1327, woke an entire village, but not one person dared investigate. Inside the castle's deepest dungeon, England's deposed king was dying in a way so horrific that his killers had spent weeks planning every detail. The stone chamber reeked of decay. For months, they'd piled rotting animal carcasses in the pit below Edward's cell. The stench was deliberate, calculated, designed to break a king's spirit before they broke his body. 3 men entered the cell that night. One carried a horn, another gripped an iron rod. The third tended a brazier of glowing coals. Edward knew what was coming. He'd watched them heat the rod until it glowed white-hot. The horn wasn't for music. It was to protect against external wounds, because whoever planned this murder wanted something specific. A corpse without marks, a king dead without evidence. The screaming started just after midnight. It echoed off stone walls, burst through iron bars, and rolled across the September fields. Villagers pulled blankets over their heads. Guards found reasons to patrol elsewhere, because everyone knew, when you hear a king dying, you stay silent. By dawn, Edward II was dead. The man who'd inherited England's throne 20 years earlier, who'd loved the wrong people, fought the wrong battles, and defied every rule of medieval kingship, ISA, had paid the ultimate price for being different. But here's the thing. How does a king end up tortured to death in his own kingdom? How does royal blood provide no protection? You need to understand that Edward's death started decades earlier, with a father's rage and a prince who refused to be the son England demanded. The future King Edward I grabbed a fistful of his son's hair and pulled hard. The ripping sound echoed through Westminster Hall as young Edward cried out, more from shock than pain. His crime? Asking his father to grant lands and titles to Piers Gaveston, a nobody knight from Gascony. "You want to give away my lands?" The old king's voice shook Westminster's stones. To him? See, medieval princes were supposed to want specific things. War victories, political marriages, expanding territories. But Edward wanted none of that. While his father conquered Scotland, young Edward preferred thatching roofs with common workers. When nobles discussed battle tactics, Edward was learning to breed horses. The court watched their future king choose manual labour over combat training, NDC, and they were horrified. Edward's friendship with Gaveston went beyond typical royal favouritism. They shared clothes, inside jokes, a private language that excluded everyone else. The prince gave Gaveston his own jewels, his finest horses, even family heirlooms meant for future queens. Old King Edward saw what everyone saw. His son loved this Gascon knight with an intensity that threatened the throne itself. The hair-pulling incident was just the beginning. Edward I banished Gaveston from England, threatening death if he returned. The prince begged, negotiated, even attempted hunger strikes. Nothing worked. His father's message was crystal clear. Choose the throne or choose Gaveston. You cannot have both. One day, young Edward told his friend as Gaveston boarded the ship to exile, "I'll bring you back." The old king heard about that promise. He summoned his son for what witnesses called the breaking. Hours of shouting, threats of disinheritance. At one point, the king threw a chair that barely missed his son's head. But Edward had already made a decision that would haunt him to his grave. He would wait. For 7 years, Edward played the dutiful son. He attended council meetings, participated in Scottish campaigns, even agreed to marry the French princess Isabella. He learned to hide his true nature behind a mask of compliance. But everyone close to him knew the truth. The prince was counting days until his father died. "He's planning something," the Earl of Lincoln warned other nobles. "The moment the crown touches his head, everything changes." They tried to extract promises from Edward, oaths to maintain his father's policies, guarantees about appointments and territories. Edward agreed to everything with a smile that never reached his eyes. Because he knew what they didn't, promises made under duress meant nothing to a king. The court watched Edward transform during those final years. He mastered the art of saying what powerful men wanted to hear while revealing nothing of his true intentions. When discussing his upcoming coronation, he'd defer to tradition and protocol. When asked about Gaveston, he'd change the subject to tax revenues or Scottish rebels. But at night, Edward wrote letters, hundreds of them, all to Gaveston in exile. Palace servants later testified about the prince staying awake until dawn, writing by candlelight. He never sent these letters. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, he kept them locked in a chest, waiting for the day he could deliver them personally. Old King Edward died on July 7th, 1307, still campaigning against Scotland. They say his last words were instructions about governing, about being strong, about resisting favourites and flatterers. His son wasn't there to hear them. Edward was already racing south to claim his throne and to keep a 7-year promise. What the court didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Within hours of his father's death, Edward II dispatched his fastest riders to France. Their message was simple: come home immediately, by order of the king. The nobles who'd served Edward I gathered for the funeral, expecting continuity, tradition, stability. They believed the new king would need their guidance, their experience, their approval. They had no idea that Edward had spent 7 years planning his revenge, not with violence, but with something far more dangerous. He would use the crown itself as a weapon. Every tradition they held sacred, every protocol they demanded, every limitation they tried to impose, Edward would shatter them all. And he'd do it legally, regally, with all the power his father's conquest had accumulated. And when old King Edward finally died in 1307, his son's first act would shock every noble in England, because Edward had been planning his revenge for 7 long years. The sacred crown of St. Edward, lost though, touched by 30 kings, was now in the hands of Piers Gaveston, a foreign knight of no noble blood. Westminster Abbey fell silent as Gaveston carried England's most holy relic toward the new king. Earls who'd governed provinces, who'd led armies, who'd bled for England, watched a nobody perform the highest honour in the realm. Edward had recalled Gaveston within days of his father's death, not quietly, not gradually, but with royal fanfare that announced his intentions to everyone. The new king didn't just bring his favourite home, he made him Earl of Cornwall, a title reserved for royal blood. He granted him lands worth fortunes. He gave him power second only to the crown itself. "He's lost his mind," the Earl of Lancaster muttered to his allies. Cornwall has been a royal title for centuries. But Edward was just beginning. At the coronation feast, Gaveston's arms hung alongside royal banners. The seating arrangements placed him above dukes and earls. When nobles approached to pay homage to their new king, they found Gaveston literally standing between them and the throne. The message couldn't be clearer. To reach Edward, you went through Piers. The French delegation was stunned. They'd come to see Edward crowned and to finalise his marriage to Princess Isabella. Instead, they watched the King of England fawn over Gaveston, like a lovesick peasant. Edward wore purple, but Gaveston wore royal purple too. The king's robes were magnificent, but Gaveston's were somehow more magnificent. Every gesture, every glance between them, announced what Edward had hidden for 7 years. "This is intolerable," the Earl of Warwick said during the feast. Around him, England's most powerful men nodded agreement. They'd expected favouritism. Every king had favourites. But this went beyond precedent. Edward was rewriting the rules of power, creating a partnership that made their positions meaningless. Gaveston didn't help matters. If he'd been humble, deferential, acknowledging his incredible fortune, maybe the nobles could have stomached it. Instead, he flaunted his power with devastating wit. He created nicknames for the earls. Lancaster became the Fiddler. Warwick was the Black Dog. Lincoln was Burst Belly. These names spread through court like wildfire, turning England's mighty lords into punchlines. The coronation ceremony itself broke more traditions. Edward insisted Gaveston carry the crown, not just in procession, but actually placing it near the king's head before the archbishop could complete the blessing. Ancient protocols dictated specific roles for specific nobles. Edward shattered every one. When the Earl of Lancaster was supposed to carry the ceremonial sword, Gaveston appeared with it instead. When Warwick expected to hold the sceptre, Gaveston already had it. "He's showing us our future," Lancaster told his fellow earls after the ceremony. "Accept Gaveston or lose everything." But Gaveston carrying the crown was just the first insult. During the sacred moment when Edward swore to defend England, he kept glancing at Gaveston for approval. When nobles knelt to pledge loyalty, the new king's attention wandered to wherever Gaveston stood. The Archbishop of Canterbury later wrote that he'd never seen a coronation where the king seemed so uninterested in actually becoming king. The feast afterward turned into a Gaveston showcase. Edward had commissioned new tapestries. They depicted Gaveston's coat of arms entwined with royal symbols. The entertainment included songs about their friendship, poems about loyalty triumphing over tradition. When Edward should have been discussing realm business with his lords, he was whispering with Gaveston, sharing private jokes while England's government waited. "This cannot stand," Warwick declared at a secret meeting that night. "He's making us irrelevant." The earls were whispering words that hadn't been spoken since the days of King John: deposition, rebellion, even regicide. But they needed more than anger. They needed legal grounds, popular support, international backing. Edward had given them grievances, but grievances weren't enough to topple a king. Lancaster proposed patience. Let him destroy himself. Kings who ignore their nobles don't last long. But Warwick saw deeper. This isn't ignorance. It's deliberate. He's showing us that our opinions, our traditions, our very existence, none of it matters if he doesn't want it to. They agreed to watch, wait, and document every violation of protocol. But Edward wasn't finished shocking them. His marriage to Isabella of France was approaching, a union meant to secure peace and produce heirs. The nobles thought surely, the presence of a queen would restore some normalcy. They had no idea what Edward planned for his wedding day. Within months, those whispers would turn to plots, and Edward was about to hand them the perfect weapon at his own wedding. The 12-year-old French princess watched her new husband hand her wedding gifts to another man, in front of her uncles, in front of Europe. Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV, had arrived in England expecting to become the centre of Edward's world. Instead, she found herself competing with Piers Gaveston for her own husband's attention. The wedding at Boulogne Cathedral should have been Edward's chance to reset. French nobility filled the pews. Isabella's uncles, EAC, some of Europe's most powerful men, came to witness their alliance with England. The young bride wore a gown worth a fortune, golden hair adorned with jewels sent by her father. She looked like what she was, medieval perfection, a princess from fairy tales. Edward barely glanced at her during the ceremony. His eyes kept finding Gaveston in the crowd. When speaking his vows, the king rushed through them, like a merchant concluding tedious business. Isabella noticed. Everyone noticed. The French delegation exchanged glances that spoke volumes about this disrespect to their blood. But the ceremony was nothing compared to the feast. Wedding gifts poured in from across Europe. Tapestries, jewels, golden plates, rare manuscripts. Traditional protocol demanded the king present these to his new queen, establishing her household and status. Instead, Edward called Gaveston forward. One by one, in full view of French royalty, the king handed treasures meant for Isabella to his favourite. "This tapestry from Burgundy. Piers, your chambers need warming. These jewels from Castle, they'll look magnificent on you." Isabella's uncle, Charles of Valois, gripped his wine goblet so tight it cracked. The insult went beyond personal. This was France itself being rejected for a Gascon nobody. The princess sat frozen, trained in royal composure, but still just 12 years old, watching her wedding become another man's celebration. Gaveston made it worse by accepting each gift with exaggerated gratitude, modelling jewellery meant for a queen, draping himself in fabrics intended for Isabella's chambers. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every smile, every pose, every theatrical gasp of delight twisted the knife deeper into French pride. "Your Majesty," Charles of Valois addressed Edward with ice in his voice, "surely the Queen should receive her wedding gifts." Edward waved dismissively. "Isabella will have everything she needs. Piers appreciates beauty more than most." The French prince's hand moved to his sword before diplomacy stayed it. Around the hall, English nobles watched this humiliation with mixed feelings. They hated Gaveston, but seeing French arrogance crushed had its appeal, until they remembered Isabella was their queen now too. Her humiliation reflected on England. The wedding night brought fresh horror. Edward spent it with Gaveston, leaving his child bride alone in the marriage chamber. Servants later testified they heard Isabella crying through the oak doors. Not dramatic wails, just the quiet tears of a girl who'd left everything familiar for a husband who preferred someone else. Isabella's uncle, Charles of Valois, was already writing letters that would change everything. Not to his brother, the French king. Not yet. First to the Pope, describing Edward's unnatural devotion that prevented consummation of a sacred marriage. Then to other European rulers, hinting at England's weakness under a distracted king. The seeds of international intervention were being planted before the wedding flowers wilted. But the worst insult was yet to come. The return journey to England became a Gaveston parade. Edward insisted his favourite ride between him and Isabella in the royal carriage. At every stop, Gaveston received the honours due to a queen. When they reached London, Edward presented Gaveston to the crowds first, Isabella second. The English people, expecting to celebrate their new queen, instead watched their king showcase his favourite. "I've never seen anything like it," the Bishop of London wrote. "The queen might as well be invisible." Isabella maintained perfect composure throughout. Her French tutors had prepared her for difficult marriages, political unions without love, but they hadn't prepared her for complete irrelevance. She was 12, alone in a foreign country, married to a man who gave away her wedding gifts while she watched. That night in Westminster Palace, Isabella dismissed her French ladies and sat alone at her window. She could hear Edward and Gaveston laughing in nearby chambers. The sound carried through stone walls, intimate laughter, shared secrets, the comfortable joy of lovers reunited. Everything a wedding night should contain, happening without her. She began writing in her journal, a habit that would continue for years. Her first entry was brief. "I am Queen of England in name only, but names have power, and I am patient." Those who later read her journals found that entry marked with tears. But as Isabella cried in her wedding chamber, alone, she made a vow that would take 14 years to fulfill, and when she did, Edward would pay for this night with screams. Gaveston's blood was still warm when they hacked off his head. No trial, no mercy, just noble justice delivered on a muddy road. The execution on Blacklow Hill, June 19th, 1312, marked the moment England's nobility stopped pretending to respect their king's authority. It started with exile. Again, the nobles had forced Edward to banish Gaveston multiple times, but the king always found excuses to recall him. This time, they'd extracted sacred oaths. Edward swore on holy relics, on his father's soul, on the crown itself. Gaveston would stay exiled or face death. The king agreed to save his favourite's life. Edward broke that oath within months. He couldn't help himself. Letters flew to Ireland, where Gaveston waited. "Return secretly," the king wrote. "I'll protect you." But medieval England had no secrets. Every servant could be bought, every messenger interrogated. The earls knew Gaveston was coming before he landed. Lancaster mobilised first. The king's broken his sacred oath. We're no longer bound by ours. The hunt began at Scarborough Castle, where Edward had hidden Gaveston. The earls arrived with armies, not guards, armies. They surrounded the castle like besieging a foreign enemy. When Gaveston saw the banners of Lancaster, Warwick and Hereford, he knew Edward's protection meant nothing. "Terms," Gaveston shouted from the walls. "I'll accept terms." The Earl of Pembroke, the most moderate among them, agreed to negotiate. Gaveston would surrender, travel under protection to London, receive a trial before Parliament. Pembroke swore on his honour, a medieval guarantee worth more than gold. Gaveston, trusting in aristocratic codes, opened the gates. They travelled south slowly, Pembroke's men guarding the prisoner. At Deddington they stopped for rest. Pembroke left to visit his wife nearby, trusting his men to hold Gaveston safely. That night, everything changed. The Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog, as Gaveston had mockingly named him, arrived with armed riders. "Where's your protection now?" Warwick asked, as his men dragged Gaveston from bed. They bound him like a common thief, threw him across a horse, and rode through darkness toward Warwick Castle. But Warwick had no intention of reaching his fortress. This would end on the road, away from witnesses who might testify later. At Blacklow Hill, they stopped. Lancaster was already there, waiting. The Earl of Lancaster had made his decision. Law didn't matter anymore. When kings broke oaths, when favourites returned from exile, when the realm's stability crumbled for one man's passion, then nobles made their own justice. He nodded to the executioner, a man who'd killed Scottish prisoners, who knew how to make death quick or slow. "Any last words?" Lancaster asked Gaveston. "Tell the king," Gaveston began, then stopped. What message could capture this moment? That Edward's love had killed him? That royal promises were wind? He straightened instead, finding dignity in his final moments. "I'm ready." The first blow took his head half off. The second finished it. They left his body on the roadside like executed criminals, a message written in blood. The Earl of Cornwall, Edward's beloved, the man who'd carried England's crown, ended as carrion for crows. When Edward found the body, something inside him broke forever. He'd been hunting when the news arrived, laughing moments before a messenger whispered death into his ear. The king rode alone to Blacklow Hill, dismissing his guards, needing to see for himself. Gaveston's body lay in mud, head separated, blood long dried. Edward fell to his knees beside it, gathering the corpse against his chest. Witnesses said the king made sounds they'd never heard, not quite screaming, not quite sobbing, something between animal pain and human grief. "You'll pay," Edward whispered to the air, "to England, to God himself. Every one of you will pay." He commanded Gaveston's body be retrieved with full honours. The corpse was embalmed, dressed in cloth of gold, placed in a chapel with candles burning day and night. For 2 years, Edward refused burial, visiting the preserved body, speaking to it, planning revenge while stroking dead hair. The nobles watched their king's descent into grief madness with growing alarm. They'd eliminated Gaveston to restore proper governance. Instead, they'd created something worse, a king who now hated them with focused intensity. Edward would smile in council, agree to proposals, sign documents, then return to Gaveston's corpse and whisper promises of vengeance. "We've made him dangerous," Pembroke warned the others. "Grief makes men reckless." Edward buried Gaveston with royal honours, but he'd soon learn that killing the king's favourite was just practice. The barons were planning something worse. 20,000 English soldiers watched their king turn his horse and flee. At Bannockburn, Edward II ran from Scots half his number. June 24th, 1314, became the day England discovered their king was exactly what his father had feared, a coward who preferred comfort to combat. The English army that marched to Bannockburn should have been invincible. Heavy cavalry that had crushed armies across Europe, Welsh longbowmen who could pierce armour at 200 yards, supply trains stretching for miles. Edward had assembled the largest force ever sent against Scotland, determined to finish his father's conquest and prove his critics wrong. Robert the Bruce waited with 6,000 men, outnumbered 3-1, facing England's military machine. The Scottish king had only terrain and desperation. He chose his ground carefully: boggy marshes that would trap heavy horses, narrow approaches that negated numerical advantage. While Edward's army approached in glorious display, Bruce prepared killing fields. The battle began at dawn with single combat. Henry de Bohun, an English knight, spotted Bruce alone and charged, seeing glory in killing the Scottish king. Bruce waited calmly, then split Bohun's skull with one axe blow. Scottish soldiers erupted in cheers. English knights felt the first chill of uncertainty. "Attack now," urged the Earl of Gloucester, while they're still celebrating. But Edward hesitated. The ground looked treacherous. His advisers argued about tactics. Hours passed as the king dithered, letting Bruce prepare further. When Edward finally ordered advance, the sun was high and Scottish positions were fortified. The English heavy cavalry charged into prepared spears, schiltrons, hedgehogs of death that horses couldn't break. Trapped in boggy ground, unable to maneuver, knights died by hundreds. Welsh arrows couldn't find targets through the press of their own men. Everything that made England's army formidable became liability in those narrow, muddy fields. But as the Scottish schiltrons advanced, Edward made a decision that would define him. He could have rallied his men, led a charge personally, died gloriously like a king should. Instead, he looked at the Scottish advance, at his dying knights, at the battle turning to slaughter, and he ran. The king's leaving. The cry spread through English ranks faster than Scottish steel. 500 chosen knights surrounded Edward as he fled. Behind them, leaderless English soldiers discovered what happens when kings abandon battlefields. Some fought to the death, maintaining honour their sovereign had discarded. Most ran, trampling each other in panic, drowning in streams, hunted through countryside by Scottish riders. His own guards would later whisper about what they saw during that flight. Edward threw away his royal banner to ride faster. He discarded armour worth fortunes. When horses died from exhaustion, he commandeered fresh ones from his own knights, leaving them to Scottish mercy. The King of England cared only for reaching safety. "Faster!" Edward screamed at every pause. "They're coming!" But the Scots weren't pursuing, they were too busy slaughtering the abandoned army. Edward fled from phantoms, from his own cowardice given form. He didn't stop until reaching Dunbar Castle, where he boarded a ship for Berwick, leaving Scottish soil forever. The scale of disaster defied comprehension. England's greatest nobles lay dead or captured. The army that could have conquered Europe was destroyed by farmers with spears. Millions in gold, armour, weapons, supplies, enriched Scotland for generations. But worse than material loss was the spiritual destruction. England had followed a coward king into battle and paid the price. "He never looked back," reported the Earl of Pembroke, one of the few nobles to survive. "Not once did our king turn to see his army dying." News of Bannockburn spread across Europe within weeks. French chroniclers delighted in England's humiliation. The Pope received reports of a king who'd inherited his father's kingdom and thrown it away in single mourning. Isabella heard the news at Windsor, where she was raising Edward's heir. Witnesses said she smiled, just slightly, before returning to her needlework. Edward reached London expecting sympathy, comfort, understanding. Instead, he found a kingdom that could barely look at him. Merchants who'd funded the campaign wanted explanations. Widows wanted to know why their husbands died while the king lived. Parliament wanted accountability for the greatest military disaster in English history. The Scots had God on their side, Edward told anyone who'd listen. But England knew better. God hadn't made Edward flee. Cowardice had. The same weakness that made him give crown jewels to favourites, that made him prefer craftsmen to warriors, had finally revealed itself when realm needed strength. As Edward fled toward England, he didn't know his wife Isabella was watching from the castle walls, and she'd finally seen enough weakness. Isabella of France stood in the French court, refusing her husband's commands to return. The little girl from the wedding had become something terrifying. By 1325, the abandoned bride had transformed into a political force that would soon earn history's darkest nickname, the She-Wolf of France. 13 years of humiliation had been Isabella's teacher. She'd learned patience, watching Edward lavish attention on Gaveston. She'd learned cunning, surviving the rise of new favourites, the Despensers, who made Gaveston look moderate. She'd learned hatred birthing Edward's children, while he preferred his favourites' beds. Now, at age 30, she was ready to graduate from student to master. The excuse for leaving England came from Edward himself. Tensions with France over Gascony required diplomatic solutions. Who better to negotiate than the French princess who'd become England's queen? Edward, distracted by Hugh Despenser's whispers, agreed without seeing the trap. He'd just handed his greatest enemy a legitimate reason to escape. 3 months, Isabella promised as she boarded the ship. "I'll secure peace and return." She had no intention of returning. The moment Isabella reached Paris, she began building alliances. Her brother, King Charles IV, received her with honours that highlighted what England had denied. French nobles who remembered the wedding's insults now saw Isabella's strength. She held court like the queen Edward never let her be. Then Roger Mortimer arrived, escaped from the Tower of London, sentenced to death for rebelling against Edward. Mortimer was